Hey, welcome back to Ground Zero Salem. It's your host, Pat. So, haven't done one of these in a little while, one of these Year of Our Lord videos where I talk about what was going on in my life and what I was listening to in a particular year. This is a pretty noteworthy one. This is the year that I kind of shrugged off metal for a while, for about a year and a half, and got into some other genres and just kind of turned my back on metal. I came back a few years later. The reasons being, it's kind of, I don't know, I think I was affected like anybody else was at the time by certain cultural shifts, and the fact that I didn't really like a lot of stuff that was coming out. Everything was kind of going in that groove-oriented direction, and it didn't appeal to me. I remember the second Fear Factory record coming out, I think, was it Demanufacture or something like that? Everybody just kind of aping Pantera. They were no exception. Domination by Morbid Angel, I didn't like it at all at the time when it came out, which is weird because I listen to it now and it's definitely not my favorite, but it's not nearly as bad as I remember it. Ooh, excuse me. A lot of stuff like that. There was not really much of a metal scene in Syracuse, like a straight pure metal scene. A lot of the people that were involved in it, as small as it was, were older and kind of unapproachable. And I don't know, I just found myself craving something, I guess, more obscure. I don't know. A lot of the hardcore of the day was also starting to kind of wear down on me, at least the stuff that was popular in my town. The super chuggy, increasingly metal-influenced straight-edge hardcore was starting to just kind of wear on me. I was craving stuff that was fast and that was dark, but in a way different than a lot of the metal that I was into. There's just something that my ears were taking in that wasn't enjoying metal very much. I don't know why. And it didn't last. I came back around a couple years later. I got really into crust punk, which kind of led me back through to death metal and some other stuff. But I jumped headfirst into death rock, goth, if you want to call it that, and a lot of 80s punk. I think basically the way I think about it is the middle of the 90s, I realized I was living in the middle of the 90s, and I kind of became to be of the opinion that the 80s were much better for music. I think a lot of people, kind of started feeling that way. Got that kind of born too late kind of feeling. But anyway, I was listening to a lot of stuff that was kind of leading down that path up until then. Bloody Kisses came out, I think, a few years before 1993. I listened to that record into the ground, and I think I grasped that there was something else influencing it other than just metal. After doing my homework and absorbing a lot of different types of music, I mean, you can pick up on the Cult influence, I feel, and the Swans influence, and Sisters of Mercy influence on this record. But I definitely loved it for years to come, up until I discovered like 80s underground death rock stuff and goth stuff. But yeah, this Bloody Kisses. I don't even have the cover anymore. This was another early one, probably late 94, but listened to it a shit ton through 95. This is the Cure singles collection, Standing on a Beach, which has all the singles on one side and the B-sides on the other. And convincing myself to buy this was a feat in itself when I did, because there are all these death metal albums that had just come out, and I wasn't sure, I was like, oh, I could buy Morgoth or Benediction, that stuff's, and I was like, no, like, there was almost like some kind of weird moral force forcing me to be open-minded or something. I had a lot of trouble, like, actually purchasing this. I hemmed and hawed, because I only had like $10, but I bought this and fell in love with it, still do. This is the original copy that I bought at that time. Big deal for me. Just the kind of morose, sort of poppy way that the Cure approached songs. I mean, the stuff is great, I loved it. Didn't quite get it at first, what they were going for. A lot of this I didn't quite understand, because I thought, to be kind of melancholic in your music, you just had to sound like My Dying Bride, and just kind of absorbing and understanding the whole aim and like the artistic intent, if you will, of a lot of that like post-punk goth stuff. It kind of took me a while to digest it. But sometime in 95, back in my day, when we used to wear onions on our belts, catch the Simpsons reference. You know, pre-internet, blah, blah, blah. There was a lot of depending on your local record store clerk to hip you to music you didn't know about before. And this guy, Bill, who was an SU student who worked at a local record store that I've mentioned numerous times on the channel called Oliver's Records on Marshall Street in Syracuse, New York. He was kind of my go-to guy for recommendations on a lot of stuff, and I was asking him, I was like, what's some of this goth music, like what's good? And these are all super obvious bands now, but at that time you had to go buy t-shirts people were wearing and that sort of thing. I mean, I'm sure in bigger cities there were scenes where you could go to goth and industrial nights, which I would do shortly thereafter to hear the music, but at that time I had nothing to go on. I was a high school kid, just hanging out on SU campus. So he made me a mixtape when I asked him that question, asked him for recommendations. I still have it. It's on a TDK metal, the chrome metal dark cassette. Crucified in the Public Eye is what he called it, what he titled it. Very goth. Dark Age of Music, 1978 to 1986. Bauhaus and beyond. And it's got the basics. You know, it's got Bauhaus, Joy Division, Sisters of Mercy, and The Cure. Can't get any more basic than that, but his picks for the songs are perfect. Stigmata Martyr, Hollow Hills, Passion of Lovers, and She's in Parties by Bauhaus, Joy Division, Disorder, Love Will Tear Us Apart, and New Dawn Fades live. Sisters, you got Temple of Love, Gimme Shelter by the Stones, Black Planet, Lucretia, 1969 by the Stooges, and The Cure, just one song, A Forest. And that song was and still is one of my favorite Cure songs. I got more and more into stuff as the summer came on. Completely abandoned any interest in going to metal or hardcore shows for a while. Went to a few of those like kind of goth industrial dance nights. I also started to turn into not into a bad kid. Like I didn't ever get arrested or anything like that, but I was definitely sneaking out. That summer I started partying. I wasn't really much of I didn't drink or anything like that. I on and off claimed straight edge, but I started partying with people that were older than me. A lot of people in their mid-20s and stuff like that, hanging out in cemeteries and all kinds of shit. I never did anything bad, but I was around some people that were doing some very bad things, let's put it that way. Hanging out with some older punks from Syracuse from when there was a punk, big mohawk kind of punk scene, and goths and other weirdos. It was definitely a coming-of-age kind of summer thing. But, and I was listening to all this stuff, but I was also kind of exploring a lot of 80s punk rock and hardcore, which always appealed to me, and I always wondered where it went. As I mentioned in my Eric Bauer contest video, I was super into that movie Suburbia around that time. That was when I got into it. And it was odd to me. I was like, how did we get from here, from these wild circle pits and all this violence? Not that I, believed that movie was real life or anything, but I knew that was a real depiction of what the LA punk scene looked like, to the fashion at the time, which was gigantic pants, beaded necklaces, basically, in a lot of cases, not always, I like a lot of that music still, but in a lot of cases was bad metal, with people the whole beginning of all the kung fu dancing was happening. I wanted to find somewhere that the 80s spirit of punk and hardcore was alive, so I got really into that stuff. So it was a kind of a double-sided coin of the goth industrial stuff and the old school 80s punk rock kind of shit. Yeah, and at that time, I was discovering that I loved the Sisters of Mercy. And I really liked First, Last, and Always. That's probably my favorite LP by them. Just those dark crooning, Andrew Eldritch vocals, the beats, the drum machine, all the sort of echoey guitar lines, that sort of post-punk, sort of spiraling, guitar licks and stuff, just really ensnared me. This being pretty stripped down, not as stripped down as the Some Girls Wander by Mistake, all the early singles, which I also loved, especially the song Temple of Love, the original version, which Bill put on that tape. I also really like the more fleshed out and produced Floodland record. It's when they started kind of introducing don't know if the focus is... Whoa. Still working out the kinks of the new camera there. When they started using like female backing vocals and stuff, Vision thing is cool. I hated it at first because it had that kind of, you know, almost LA sleaze metal guitar over stuff, and that didn't appeal to me at the time, especially because I was on a distinctly non-metal kick. But going back and listening to it now, I like it a lot. A lot of people recommended Christian Death for me, and I like this record. It's really the only record I've gotten into by them. You know, they split off into a couple of camps. It turned into like two different versions kind of thing, one with Roz Williams and one with Valor. To this day, I am sure I've heard a couple of Valor songs, but I have no idea what they sound like. It seems like people prefer the Roz stuff, but this is almost like just mean LA hardcore, but more morbid, in a way. The guitars, the riffs are really punchy and really angry. Very, very whiny, you know, sort of like Robert Smith-style vocals, but really, really pained. Pretty much as goth as it gets as far as vocals go, so it might not be for everybody, but I love it. This is came out on Frontier, big LA punk label. They put out, you know, Circle Jerks, Suicidal, all the usual suspects. It's just a repress, I'm sure. Yeah, it's definitely a repress, because now I just remembered it was sealed when I bought it. So yeah, all basic stuff, you know. There are a few things, like, I knew a few people that, you know, went to those goth industrial nights that were into, like, current bands. I'm sure there were some good ones, but there were a lot of bad ones. A big label for all that stuff was Cleopatra Records. And they were kind of a reissue label. I know they reissued a lot of punk stuff, like The Exploited. But they also put out a ton of bands that were... a bunch of bands that were kind of like Sisters of Mercy worship bands, like Rosetta Stone and Nosferatu. I never cared for either of those at all, especially Nosferatu. But the Wake were pretty good. For a band that was aping Sisters of Mercy heavily, they had some really good songwriting. This track, Sheet Metal Eyes in particular, is a real banger. This came out on Cleopatra in the mid-90s. So I like them. There are a handful of others. Syracuse didn't really have much of a scene for that kind of stuff. They had a weird sort of goth industrial band called Delta Venus that named after the Aeneas Nin erotica that I really haven't... I had their tapes. I remember them being kind of boring, and I think they called it a day by the time I was really getting into this stuff. And I think Rochester had some bands as well. But by the time I moved to Rochester, I had kind of gone through my... finished up on my phase for this stuff. Anyways, of course you got Joy Division. Gotta have Joy Division. Still, you know, this is kind of a partied on copy of Still, but can't go wrong with the packaging that Factory put together for this. It was years and years before I got into or could appreciate New Order. For whatever reason, during this time, I didn't really like the new wave, like, synth pop stuff, even though it was, like, 1 degree away. I don't know why. It was years and years before I started to get into, like, Depeche Mode or New Order. But yeah, Joy Division, classic, you know. Morose post-punk. So should I start with the punk? I might as well. Yeah, it was party time for me, and I got into everything ranging from, like, the pop-punkier side of things to like, more, like, 80s hardcore, and that's pretty much where I stuck with everything. Constantly spun this that summer and the summer after. This is Sloppy Seconds Destroyed. Absolute classic. 3-chord, 4-chord, trash culture-centric, anthemic, drunk, fat, and stupid punk rock. I'd say in a 90s context it's pop-punk, but if you compare it to something like Dillinger 4, it's just punk rock. It's great. Tons of Russ Meyer references, lots of like 50s horror kind of stuff in the lyrics and the lyrical themes. Just awesome. They cover the Candyman from Willy Wonka, which is really creepy. Yeah, I love this record. I love everything this band's done. They're one of my pantheon of dozen or so favorite bands of all time. mentioned the Misfits before, but I really got into Walk Among Us probably around that time, 95. This is just a year before that box set came out and everything got unearthed in the Collection 2 and the reissue of Static Age and everything. But this was a perfect marriage of the speed that I was familiar with from Earth AD, but the catchier moments from the collection. I think a lot of people's favorite Misfits record for a good reason. It's just relentlessly good, relentlessly catchy. Fear More Beer. This was the first Fear that I got. You know, a lot of people are into the record, and the record is great. I think they're equally as good. To a lot of listeners, a lot of fans of punk, and especially Fear, this is like second banana to the record. I love More Beer. I think it's awesome. I like it just as much. I think Fear's appeal was that, you know, they were real musicians. They could really play their asses off. And they had, you know, a lot of fast ragers of hardcore songs, but they had, like, really weird, angular songs, too, that were just kind of odd. Maybe slightly kind of almost post-punk in a way. Like, Welcome to the Dust Lord's a weird one. There's an odd sense of humor on this. Like, they're known for being, you know, offensive on purpose in an 80s context, like a lot of bands like the Meatmen or SOD or something like that. But it's tongue firmly planted in chic, and they get just straight up bizarre with songs like Waiting for the Meat and things like that. Null Detector is kind of a weird one, too. But Responsibility is my jam from this one. All about working your ass off and not having any time. Ain't it the truth? Another thing that was getting big at the time that I became aware of was that all this like melodic punk from the West Coast was a thing. Previously mentioned in a video prior, I think the last one from '94, I talked about getting into Screeching Weasel, and you know, I started paying a little bit of attention to all this poppy stuff coming out on Fat Records and Epitaph. I had a brief love with Bad Religion. Suffer, great record. First couple of Bad Religion records, loved them. Got Suffer kicking around somewhere, I'm not going to dig it out. This was a huge one for me, though, Punk and Drublic. I listened to this into the ground when it came out. It's still, I think, their best record, really, overall, in my opinion. Heard a bit of them here and there from some mixtapes from a friend of mine. You know, time and place kind of thing. Again, another punk band that could really, really add some chops and play their asses off. 3- and 4-part harmonies, you know, kind of surf influenced kind of stuff. Yeah, did it hold up for me? Yeah, I still listen to this stuff now and again. If you want to read a good rock and roll biography, check out I think it's called the Hepatitis Bathtub. It's the name of the NoFX book, autobiography, where they all write their own personal accounts of stuff that happened back in the day, much in the same spirit as Motley Crue's The Dirt. It's talk about the craziest shit you'll ever read. But anyway, yeah, this ripped. I listened to it into the ground. This, and I've already shown it like 2 or 3 times, but I listened to Rancid Let's Go like crazy. And that was that, you know, that period, 94, 95. Metal was falling out of favor. Green Day broke big. You know, everybody had started dyeing their hair green and that kind of thing. And that was kind of a springboard for me, although I was well familiar with GBH and The Exploited and the old New York stuff like Agnostic Front and even some more obscure stuff here and there like Negative Approach. I think it was around this time I started paying attention to like current day punk stuff, and I guess it made sense to start with NoFX and Rancid. I got sick of it real quickly and was poo-pooing it like a year later, but that's how teenagers are, you know. I love this. No, I hate this. It's not cool anymore. A couple of underground bands I just picked up because I liked the covers at that time in 95, probably at Oliver's. But this band, The Undesirables, this is Destruction Chaos. It's just a real violent, angry, hardcore street punk kind of stuff, a little bit of an oi edge to it. Really nasty. I got this around the same time as second Casualty 7-inch, A Fucking Way of Life, which I never really cared for that band too much after that, but that first Casualty 7-inch that I bought is a fucking total rager. It's great. I also got this band, The Denied. Getting used to this new camera and the way to hold the records is going to be a real challenge. There we go. The Denied. This band went on to become Distraught, shared members. It's funny because it's pretty metal for what I was into at the time. It's very crusty, but it's just anthemic and pogo-y enough for me to really enjoy it. And this still is like a $2 or $3 record. Like, nobody talks about this band, nobody gives a shit. But it is a great record. I don't know why it's not considered a crust punk classic like a lot of other stuff. Summer of '95, I should mention that I went to Boston for the first time, and went with some people that I knew. I went with a guy who claimed that he knew all about the Boston punk scene, that he was from there, and I don't know. Maybe not. But we ended up just going to Newbury Street and nowhere else in the Boston area. Whereas at that time, 1995, all the punk rockers hung out in Harvard Square. So you think you would have known that. Newbury Street's kind of like a trendy area of town. Like, it's very expensive, you know, lots of boutiques and stuff like that. But they did have and still have a Newbury Comics, which was one of the better ones in the city that had the most stuff. And I was familiar with 7 Seconds, but I believe this is the first one that I own by them. And this also is my original copy from those days, somehow not destroyed and still playable. And to this day, it's the only 7 Seconds I really ever reached for. A lot of people love The Crew. I mean, The Crew has great songs on it. Also, the really early 7-inches, like the Skins, Brains, and Guts 7-inch are good. But this is extremely tight, rapid fire, you know, very early, for lack of a better term, posy hardcore stuff, posy hardcore punk. It's got a lot of the same songs from The Crew, just done like, I like the production better, it's more stripped down. Anyway, yeah, just awesome stuff, you know, in the vein of like Minor Threat, you know, if you're not familiar with 7 Seconds. And also really, I mean, to bridge the gap between the two kind of genres that I was really into, I was very fond of The Damned. I just had a best of at the time, which I no longer have, so I'll just show off the two that I happen to own. Machine Gun Etiquette and the self-titled. 77 Punk, you know, had an interesting visual aesthetic. They had a guy who dressed like a vampire who sang. And as the years went on, they kind of took on a more shadowy, kind of gloomy sound, at least on the Phantasmagoria record. But this is just great early 77 punk stuff. You know, it's especially the self-titled release. It's just great 3-chord, tight punk rock. The other one, things get a little bit more melodic. The production's a little bit more advanced. And the song Love Song from this is definitely pretty reminiscent of Motorhead, which makes sense. I mean, Lemmy was in The Damned for a hot minute, and I think they called themselves The Doomed at the time. Another one that's kind of on the borderlands there, the band that I loved and still do. Weird that I got into this band so early and not other stuff. I'd heard Crass. I bought a Crass compilation, 80 to 84, I think it's called. And I never really cared for it that much. Just the songs were too long and too meandering. Feeding the 5000, I think I heard around that time. I liked that record okay. But this band was related to Crass Records and worked with them. This is Rudimentary Penized Cacophony record. And this record is incredible. This is their second LP. Very short songs. It manages to come off as being very jarring and otherworldly and all over the place. And scary sounding, and mentally addled in a punk context of only using, you know, 3 chords and stuff like that. Whole thing has H.P. Lovecraft's imprint and influence all over it, as well as like Edgar Allan Poe and some other early 20th century horror authors. But man, it just Arkham Hearst, Night Gaunts, Horrors in the Museum, you get the idea. Nick Blinko, the vocalist, songwriter, brain behind the project, had a lot of mental health issues that worked really well for his art. And most of their records are great. Death Church, their first full-length, is excellent. The EPs are really good. Echoes of Anguish, I think, was a later EP by them that I really enjoyed. But yeah, just definitely coming from a very dark place. And there's still that sort of anarcho-punk, belted out kind of vibe to it. Raw, belted out kind of stuff. Heavy-hitting drums, that sort of thing. I guess I should mention industrial. I was into some industrial too. We'll wrap it up with that. So, Vivisect 6 by Skinny Puppy. The industrial fans' industrial band. Unlike Ministry and Nine Inch Nails, they didn't weave in too much of other influences. The vocals are processed and harsh and shrieking. Very abrasive beats, you know, kind of noisy stuff that was kind of taken from the earlier industrial bands, but more focused and orchestrated into actual song structures. Just a great band. Lots of animal rights themes and political themes. You know, if you want to, this was a great place for me to start for industrial. I was familiar with Nine Inch Nails. I think the Downward Spiral came out a year or two before this. I liked it okay. I liked a couple songs. I never really got into them. I also really liked Rabies, another coverless cassette here. This was decidedly more metal. Al Jorgensen played guitar on this, and you can hear the Ministry influence. It was a cool collaboration, but it's really the only Skinny Puppy record that sounds like this. And somewhere, oh, here it is. Too Dark Park. For me, for my money, the last great record that they did. A little bit slower, a little less dancey, for lack of a better term, than Vivisect 6 or Cleanse, Fold, and Manipulate, which was another one of their great LPs. This has almost more of a trance-like kind of quality to it, from what I remember. I haven't listened to this stuff in a while. Good stuff. Last Rites, their record after this, is also very good, but I don't know how to put it. It's so intense and dark, it makes it almost like a hard listen sometimes. At least that's what I remember of it. Maybe I can handle it better now. I don't know. It's been 20 years. Dead Can Dance. I mean, I just talked about them recently in my record collection update, but I should at least throw out there that I was listening to them a ton at the time, and I love them. Still to this day, they've been the most consistent band for me that I just kind of always stuck with, regardless of what phase of listening I've been in. Just mystical, medieval-influenced, post-punk, new wave, death rock, whatever you want to fucking call them. They're in a league of their own, really. It's cool that they take medieval music from around, or took medieval music from all over the world, and kind of melded it into this weird mix, this weird melange, if you will, with beautiful female vocals and total crooner-style male vocals, and almost remind me of Frank Sinatra. All kinds of interesting, great instrumentation on their early work. As their career went on, they kind of took on more and more influences from more and more eras and more parts of the world, and they kind of dropped off from me after Into the Labyrinth. They started kind of getting more of a, I don't know, like kind of a Native American music influence, and I wasn't so into it at the time, so I stopped paying attention, but who knows, you know, I might come back around to it at some point. So that's 1995. We'll be talking about 96 after this, of course, and discussing my senior year of high school and the chaos that ensued after that. I am starting to have a ton of CD stuff piling up, as far as like update collection stuff. A lot of 90s death metal I've been binging on. Yeah, purging would be if I was throwing it up. Maybe I'll do that too. But anyway, yeah, tons and tons of shit coming in to talk about. Just haven't really felt like doing a collection update in a while, but I've been listening to so much great shit, and it's starting to build up. So I'm gonna be blasting you folks with a ton of death metal and black metal from the 90s primarily soon. So that's what's up for the channel coming up shortly. All right, peace out.